rigidly. So thanks speakers. And I see we're still missing 4 of our presenters, but that's fine, they'll catch up. The first, we're going to have a stream of people coming in now. Okay, so the first presentation we've got this morning is Bob Smith from the University of Kent, and he's going to be chatting to us about learning from nature and learning from people, using a diversity of approaches to identify priority areas for conservation. Thanks, Bob.
Okay, cheers, thanks Kevin. Yes, thank you very much for coming. To start off, acknowledging my co-authors, Bruno and Pete. For people who came to Pete's talk yesterday, he was saying that having retired, he didn't know who he was affiliated to anymore. So that's his affiliation now, there on the right. It's like, and obviously WWF has taken some liberties about what a panda looks like, just to make it more aesthetically pleasing. But I think Pete's logo is possibly pushing it too far. But anyway, so what I'm going to talk about today is systematic conservation planning, and sort of look at the broad approach and talk about some new initiatives both in South Africa and globally that I think are relevant to the sorts of things that we're interested about, and talk about sort of how actually decisions get made. We're in South Africa. This is almost the home of systematic conservation planning now. South Africa is rightly recognised as the place in the world for doing amazing stuff. But just in case some people don't know what systematic conservation planning is, it was an approach sort of initially developed in the 1980s, and it's used for identifying priority areas for conservation. And really the key thing about it is at the beginning you list your species and habitats, ecological processes that you're interested in conserving, you set targets for them, and then often you use software to identify priority areas for meeting those targets. So to illustrate the sort of output you get, this is a map from work that we did in the Carpathian Mountains in Eastern Europe. The areas in bright green are the new areas that you need to meet targets set for a whole set of species and habitat types. So a key part of systematic conservation planning is that you map your biodiversity, you map the things that you're interested in. Then, as I say, you set targets, so these are numerical targets for each one of your conservation features, each one of your species and habitats. And another really key thing about systematic conservation planning is minimising costs. So you also input a cost layer, and really the balance that you're going for is that you're trying to meet your targets while minimising costs. So the two things that people really focus on a lot are those two issues. So when it comes to setting targets, as I say, it involves setting explicit numerical values for how much of each feature you want to represent in your conservation network. And targets are immensely important for a whole range of aspects of conservation planning.
Sorry, can we all just come in quickly and settle down, please? Thanks. Sorry, Bob.
That's okay.
-5. Okay.
It's +5.
+5, yeah. Okay. I think we need to lock doors. Okay. Thanks. Sorry, Bob.
Yes, so for those who missed the first minute, it was brilliant. But it sort of tapers off now, but never mind. So the key thing about setting targets is that it gives you a sort of a framework to look at monitoring progress. It also lets stakeholders know what you're trying to achieve, and it's transparent and defensible. Everyone knows at the beginning what you're trying to do. But you always need to remember that targets are always value driven. They can be based on science, but it's always a value of what science you use and how much of a particular thing you want to conserve. So for example, the vegetation targets that are used in South Africa are based on representing 75% of the plant species found in each vegetation type. Now that 75% is a political or values-driven process. So even though it's a quantitative approach, it still involves someone saying, we think 75% of species are important. And the other thing is that ecologically, more is always better. You know, we need to make sure that we don't fixate on targets. If we can conserve more of a particular feature, then in terms of conservation, that's a good thing. And as I said, you've got this balance of trying to meet the targets, but also trying to minimise costs. So you put cost data in, and often that's opportunity costs. So it might be the value of the land for agriculture or mining, or if you're looking at marine, it's the value of fisheries. And so you run the software to meet the targets, but you're trying to avoid those costly areas wherever possible. And that's, again, got real benefits for showing to stakeholders that you're trying to minimise impacts. But again, when it comes to the costs, it's the key question of whose opportunity costs are most important. There's a nice paper by Vanessa Adams and colleagues a couple of years ago where I think she was looking at Ecuador and had 3 different measures of opportunity costs for 3 different groups of people. And if you just measured it on the financial value, then you would avoid the areas that were important for commercial agriculture, and you chose the areas where the subsistence farmers lived. So it's really very political how, what opportunity costs you end up using. The other thing is that we talk about uncertainty and costs, giving the impression that sort of, well, we're saying it's about R1,000 a hectare, maybe it's 2,000, maybe it's 500. But if you look at how costs of different resources have changed over the last 10 years, it could be completely irrelevant. The whole new debate with fracking and mining, if anyone could have predicted the value of gold as it is now compared to 20 years ago, they would be very, very rich. These costs go up and down, so we need to be careful when we think about them. And also, as I said, often in conservation planning you're looking at the opportunity costs, but you're not thinking about implementation and management costs. So, I think there are 2 other really important factors that you need to consider, especially when you're looking at those issues of who's setting targets and how high should they be, what costs should we be using. One of them is opportunity, and this is the thing that Andrew Knight and Richard Cowling first wrote about in 2007, and Andrew's been relentlessly banging on every time you see him, is opportunity. When it comes to these plans, in the past, so often just are paper maps and nothing actually happens to them. So it's really important to look at how much support is there for conserving a particular site, what's the funding availability, and what conditions are there to achieve implementation. So they would argue often you just go for the areas where, especially in biodiversity-rich areas, you go for the areas where there's support rather than trying to push for somewhere that's slightly better for meeting your targets, but you've got no chance of actually implementing anything. But the other issue, which I think is talked about less, is this issue of legitimacy. The planning process is a political process, and when you're doing it, you really have to think, how legitimate is the organisation or group of people who are identifying these priorities? What's their standing, and who do they represent? And because of that, bringing those 3 things together, I think actually you can group all the different ways that people identify conservation priorities into these 3 types, which I've called statutory, irreplaceability, and opportunistic. And I'll go through these in turn. So statutory, and an example of that is the work that we've done in Mapucheland. So this is work that is basically done by the 3 statutory bodies responsible for conservation planning in Mapucheland, which is Ezemvelo and then the Mozambique and Swaziland equivalents. And because this is representing the 3 governments, and they have a mandate to conserve biodiversity, for this planning system we used a whole set of biodiversity, different species. For the cost data, we put in risk of transformation, which is a measure of how likely an area is to be cleared, but it's also a measure of opportunity cost. The areas that are most at risk are the areas that are most suitable for agriculture. So we ran the analysis, and what came out of it with this fine-scale analysis for all those different species and habitat types. So the areas in red are the ones that are most important for meeting targets while avoiding the costly areas wherever possible. And that helped guide the development of the corridor between Tembe Elephant Park and Maputo Special Reserve up in Mozambique. I should say now another aspect of legitimacy. So at the moment in the UK, we're all having to, for a big research assessment, write about how our work has amazing impact. So I'm just about to write how, because of that map on the right, that corridor on the left was created. Now everyone who works in that area knows that that's not true. For years there's been talk of creating that corridor, and there were plans to do that before we actually started doing the conservation planning project. But again, for legitimacy, those three governments were saying, we know that this is a good thing to do, but to have independent scientific advice showing that it's the right thing to do will really build on the legitimacy. So it's a sort of, again, legitimacy comes in different ways. So as it comes to legitimacy, you've got national governments. This is a system that's developed for the people of South Africa, Swaziland and Mozambique. It's also fulfilling international commitments, scientifically defensible, arguably the best approach. And because they're interested in planning in their country, it's fine scale and it's aiming at doing a landscape-based approach. And the opportunity comes because it's part of the Transfrontier Conservation Area plans anyway. There's government funding and international funding to support that. So on to the second one. And this is an example of what I call an irreplaceability-based scheme. So some of you might be familiar with this already. Several NGOs, BirdLife really championed this with their important bird areas, and then it was also adopted by Conservation International, Plant Life and IUCN Freshwater to look at what they call key biodiversity areas. And the original version of this was looking at areas that are important for species that are globally threatened, range-restricted, congregatory species or biome-restricted assemblages. Now recently, IUCN more broadly, through the SSC in particular, and also the World Commission on Protected Areas, have recognised the need to sort of expand this. The original KBAs were linked with a particular set of NGOs, and it was identified that to get broader buy-in, there would be a need to come up with a slightly different system. So a group of us met in Cambridge, as always with the group photos. I'm actually right at the back, just behind the person there. But yes, so a group of us came together, including 3 or 4 South Africans. So this is the sort of initial thing report that's come out. This is the beginning of a long-term process. I mean, as ever with IUCN, it's a long-term process to try and get as much buy-in as possible. And this is the vision and the mission that came out of this report. And I flagged up in both those. They're talking about significance for biodiversity. And this was one of the key decisions that was made right at the beginning. It's not talking about significance for conservation. Because this is a global level approach. It's designed to be applied in whichever country, irrespective of the data availability in terms of the socioeconomic data. So they're saying right from the start, we're not identifying areas that we're saying are important for conservation, because for conservation you need data on costs and opportunity. This, we're saying that these are important areas for biodiversity. And so when it comes to the legitimacy, because what will basically be representing the global conservation community, they're saying that these are globally important sites. They need conserving. They don't have to be protected areas. They can be managed in whatever way, but they need conserving. And as soon as that happens, you're saying we're less interested in the costs. These are, as I put here, these are the jewels in the crown. This is going to be the equivalent of, I guess it's sort of a level down from World Heritage sites or something like that. You're saying, these are important. Again, scientifically defensible because it's going to be a transparent system for doing it. But this is, I think, one of the things that in the literature in particular people don't talk about as much, is the fact that opportunity is not a static thing. And actually by producing a plan and identifying your priorities, suddenly that priority becomes important and so creates opportunity. So there's the expectation that it will open up funding sources, and also certainly already a lot of international mining companies and a whole group of other sectors have said that they will not work in any of the key biodiversity areas already identified. So you could have an area that was highly threatened now, but if you identify it as being important, suddenly it's less threatened, because a whole set of companies are saying, right, we won't work there. So yes, it shows that this sort of opportunity is a more dynamic thing. The opportunistic, just two examples from South Africa that unfortunately you're all more familiar with than I am, but anyway, I'll talk about them. So these are very different systems. There's the nice example of the Biodiversity and Wine Initiative, which through that, more than 40,000 hectares of the Cape is covered by informal agreements for conservation. And another example which we've heard a lot about yesterday in particular, and is a great example of groups of people achieve, on private land. Now 24% of white rhinos are on private land. Because of a series of incentives, it's encouraged people to have rhinos on their land. If one was to set a target for white rhino in a conservation plan, probably in some areas that target is exceeded. But of all the benefits that having more white rhinos has, and also in terms of the large amounts of land under conservation, no one's saying that's a bad thing. No one's saying no, we've got enough white rhino, we can stop there. So yeah, it's very different in terms of legitimacy. In this case, it's often people saying about their own land, we want to do this. And because of that, it tends to be really powerful, much quicker. You don't need the consensus. If you've got support from government and NGOs, that builds the legitimacy even more. And yeah, you've got incentives that encourage people to invest and to that harness the goodwill that's there already. So, given that we're actually, the real world is very different to, I think, the people who originally developed systematic conservation planning. A lot of them work for government or forestry in Australia, all their academics who don't know what's going on. And they just assume there's one organisation with one pot of money that's identifying priorities. And so there's this sort of underlying thought that if we've met the target for something and we spend money on going over the target, then that's a waste of money. We should be spending it elsewhere. Whereas we know in the real world it's much more complicated than that. That different people have got different priorities, there's different sets of money coming from different places, and also you can bring in different sets of money by identifying new areas. So is systematic conservation planning actually still relevant for the real world? Well, we would argue yes. One of the key things, I think as Jean Harris was talking about yesterday, it's taken them 10 years of gradually collecting marine data to now come up with some really nice data for conservation planning. You really do need someone centrally working out what you need to map and gradually improving the data, both for the systematic conservation planning approach, and then it informs a whole set of other things. By setting targets, you do identify underrepresented species and habitats, and again, if it's government that's in charge of this conservation planning, if their aim is to represent biodiversity, then it's their job to fill in the gaps. You can rely on NGOs and the private sector to conserve things that make sense for them, but it's government that can then fill in the gaps, and you need a process like that. And finally, this is a paper that Madeline Bottrell and colleagues did that just came out in Conservation Biology this year, which I think is really nice. They talked to, I think, 12 different sets of people who work for the Nature Conservancy and use the conservation planning approach, and talked to them more widely about what are the benefits of this process. And they came up, this is just sort of some of the highlights, but a whole set of things of the advantage of having this systematic conservation and planning approach embedded in an organisation. And you can see that in terms of full or partial achievement of those different things, actually it's the human-based factors that have worked, such as pride in local nature and acceptance of a plan, that they've achieved those relatively rapidly. I mean, one could argue that it's slightly worrying that what we think of systematic conservation planning are trying to do, as in conserving biodiversity, so far, after a few years, is actually, in terms of the full targets, pretty low. But, that's early days, and this is the thing that takes a long time. Whereas those other aspects, you get sort of immediate benefits that then increase as time goes on. So, in conclusion, let's say I think legitimacy is a key factor in determining the success of conservation priority setting. And I think it's worth thinking about that when we look at the success of different planning processes. Different groups are always going to have different goals, so different targets, but also different options for opportunities. And as we heard lots yesterday with the white rhino issue, and South Africa again is one of the best countries for doing this, is that we need to create and maintain incentives, because more is always going to be better. If someone is willing to pay out of their own money to conserve more of something than we need for the target, then that's great. But systematic conservation planning is going to remain vital, and especially for statutory authorities. I think that's a key thing. If you're signatory to the CBD and you're saying we aim to maintain our country's biodiversity, then you really need something like that to make sure that you're meeting your targets and achieving what you're supposed to do. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks Bob. We've got time for one question, if anybody's got a burning question. Ethel.
Bob, up on your last slide there, you had different groups with different goals. Is there not a risk of those groups contradicting each other and confusing landowners, government people, or whatever, if they're not talking to each other?
Yes,